Hello and welcome to the AdTech Heroes podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the Metaverse, and I'm delighted to be joined by Alex Thomas. Alex is a Senior Brand Safety and Quality Manager for the UK and EMEA at GroupM. Previously to GroupM, Alex worked at Mobster, Integra Ad Science and Mail Metro Media. Hi Alex, how's it going?
Hello there. Yeah, all good, thank you. All good. How are you?
Really good, thank you. Really excited about the topic today of the Metaverse. It's something that I've wanted to talk about for some time now with someone that knows what they're talking about. So yeah, great to have you on board today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
So yeah, just to kind of kickstart really for our audience, it'd be great to understand a little bit about your career and what's got you to where we are today.
So yeah, I'm trying to think how far back to go really. So I was fortunate enough prior to going to university to get the opportunity to kind of have a taste of the industry. I applied for a kind of a 6-week placement, I think it was, at Zenith Optimedia, as it was known back then. And essentially within that kind of 6 weeks, I basically just did a little bit of anything and everything, covering lots of different disciplines, search and display as it was then. Programmatic wasn't quite what programmatic is today back then. But kind of got, that was kind of my first exposure, I suppose, to the ad industry. And it was obviously an industry that I knew kind of absolutely nothing about at that point. I then went to university and studied politics, so kind of completely different direction. But then my first role in the industry was at a company called GroupM, which was a kind of a small programmatic trading desk, essentially. When I first started there, my role was primarily focused on kind of being sat within the actual DSPs themselves. So DBM as it was then, or AppNexus, and essentially kind of running the campaigns, optimizing kind of campaigns for clients. My role sort of developed slightly there as the kind of company developed and moved into more of a, it was called technical account management was the role, where I still had that kind of technical element and the trading, but we kind of looked to kind of have that hybrid role where you could directly speak to clients and agencies about the campaigns rather than having that kind of in two separate silos. I then sort of flipped that on its head and went publisher side to, as you said, mail advertising. It was an interesting time to join that company because it was sort of a tipping point for them. And I think for all publishers at that point, between kind of traditional direct sales that have kind of were there and are still there, but kind of opening up those kind of programmatic direct opportunities and how that kind of fits within their ad stack. And it was kind of at the advent of header bidding and all those types of things. So I kind of, sat within the SSPs, helped kind of create programmatic kind of PMPs, but also programmatic guaranteed deals, which were very new at the time as well. I then moved to IAS, and this, I suppose, was kind of my first exposure to brand safety specifically. This is where I kind of really got into the weeds of exactly what brand safety is, viewability, fraud, and kind of how verification was kind of an ever-increasing, really important aspect for clients. And again, this was an interesting time to work at IAS because this is when social media platforms started kind of opening their doors, I suppose, for what brand safety might look like on these platforms. I then spent some time at Mobster and headed up the account management team there, kind of looking after the team and all aspects of the campaign lifecycle. And then, I realized I've been talking for a while, but then today I'm at GroupM. So my role at GroupM today is basically to work with GroupM's agencies, brands, partners, platforms, to, in a nutshell, I suppose, mitigate risk for them across brand and user safety across all the digital media, essentially.
Wow, that's quite a journey, isn't it? Starting from politics at uni all the way to, to DSPs, SSPs, tech, data, publisher, agency, brand safety. That's given you probably now an all-round approach, right? Because, now you're working at the agency side, but you know what it's like working on the publisher side or the brand safety side. And then, would you say the education's helped in any shape or form? Like studying politics has actually helped, your career, not specifically just now and what you're doing at GroupM, but kind of like that journey.
No, absolutely. I think, I'd imagine most kind of studies do kind of help with certain disciplines that translate into this role. I imagine that quite a lot of people, I sort of fell into this industry. Don't want to speak for everyone, but I only speak for me, but I sort of did fall into it. But as you say, having that kind of, it wasn't by design, but having that kind of publisher side, verification side, and so on, and agency side is kind of, it does help to kind of try and look through that sort of ecosystem, particularly with some of the conversations around brand safety and user safety. It's not just a conversation you have in silo. It impacts kind of everyone through the supply chain. So it's kind of good to have, it's helped me basically to have an understanding of how all those different elements work.
And then, like you mentioned, from working at IAS, you've kind of more so been working in the brand safety space, the data space. And is that something that interests you most? I suppose my question is, what's the best part of your job, and is it more that part of it, or are there other elements to it?
Yeah, so I think I do really enjoy the kind of brand safety and user safety mm, aspect to it. I would I would struggle in this job if I didn't. But I think kind of the best part of this job is that I still get to work with all of those kind of different parts of the ecosystem. That was something that was really important to me. Obviously, as I said, I've kind of had roles in different areas, but at the moment, kind of being at GroupM, I'm sort of fortunate enough to work obviously with all our agencies, directly with lots of different clients, kind of a broad scope of clients, who are kind of very leaned into this space when it comes to brand safety. Still work with kind of programmatic partners, social platforms, work kind of very closely with, and obviously a very kind of key element of what brand safety looks like. And then obviously kind of still work with some of my friends back at IES and with other verification vendors as well. So it was, and to some extent still is, kind of a relatively kind of steep learning curve in this role. And kind of it doesn't really stop and stuff like that. But that's kind of why I really enjoy it. And yeah, the day-to-day as such, for want of a better term, isn't really day-to-day. It does look very different, kind of day-to-day of what my role looks like.
So the metaverse. So for me, with my very limited knowledge, I'll start with what I think the metaverse is, and obviously, I'd love to understand and hear what you think the metaverse is, and then obviously, the topic today is the metaverse, so we'll delve into it in a lot more detail. For me, it's this kind of virtual world where tons of things can happen. So whether it's for like social meeting people, networking, all the way from brands to kind of position their brand to consumers, all coming from, I suppose, from gaming. There's probably parts of or versions of the metaverse. It might not be completely new, but there's been ways and games in the past where you literally are running around this virtual world and you're interacting with each other, right? You can clearly see I'm not really a gamer either, unless it's FIFA. So yeah, I kind of like that's what it means to me. It's digital, it's virtual. There's no physical kind of touching of per se, but that's, like I said, very limited on my side. It'd be great to understand, what the metaverse means to you.
No, of course. I think, I mean, I'm very similar to you. When I first kind of heard of the metaverse, I think for most people, your mind immediately goes to gaming, which is not the wrong place to go, but it's just kind of one of the elements that makes it up. And I'm not a gamer myself, as well. So there was a lot to pick up. I think the first thing to say really is that people are still trying to define exactly what the metaverse is. I've kind of read countless different, slightly varying definitions of what it looks like. But essentially, the way that we try and think about it is in its simplest form, it's basically a convergence of our physical lives that we have today and our digital lives, kind of how that works together. So it's sort of a shared, decentralized virtual environment that kind of supports those real-time interactions that we have in real life that you can kind of compare to a real world, but how that kind of looks in a virtual world, I suppose. The way that I started to kind of really grasp a little bit more exactly how it worked was to think about the emerging technologies that sort of powered the metaverse. So if we kind of think about virtual reality and augmented reality, a year or so ago, I kind of thought I knew what they meant, but there's obviously a slight difference between them. So obviously virtual reality is, I'm sure, kind of where most people's mind goes when they think of the metaverse, of those kind of big headsets that people are wearing. And virtual reality is kind of exactly as you say, it's that really immersive experience that kind of allows users to kind of explore a completely new 3D world. You then have augmented reality or AR, and that's sort of the bridge that links those two, our real world and our virtual world. It's not the best example, but the example that comes to mind is, I think it was a couple of years ago when that kind of Pokemon game everyone seems to be walking around playing on their phone, where you kind of project a different Pokemon on you. It was the real world behind the lens, but then it kind of had that augmented reality to it as well. You then have kind of cryptos and NFTs, and I'm by no means claiming to be an expert in these kind of spaces particularly, but they are very, very important, and they're essentially the mechanics of what an economy in the metaverse looks like. I'm sure most people are kind of vaguely familiar with what crypto is, and NFTs in their simplest form, for those that might not know what they are, non-fungible tokens is what they stand for. and they're essentially a form of kind of unique digital assets, basically, that can be owned and exist on the blockchain, and they're kind of entirely virtual, basically. Then finally, I suppose what really kind of helped me to understand exactly what the metaverse might look like in its entirety is to think. I'm sure people have heard of Web 3.0. We kind of have Web 1.0, Web 2, and now kind of Web 3. The way I kind of think about it and the way it was explained to me, which helped, was Web 1 is can be kind of thought of as a sort of an information economy, sort of a read-only economy. So an example of this is you kind of go onto your news site, for example, your favorite news site, you read an article, and there's limited engagement there, basically. So it's a one-way relationship of content gets published, you read it, and so on. Web 2 is more of a platform economy. The read-only elements still exist, but since the growth of certain kind of social media in particular, there's now also kind of writability. So it's read and write, basically. It's a transactional web where you kind of have, if you think of your Instagram feed or your Facebook feed, the majority of the content that you have there isn't from Meta, it's from other users, basically. And then Web 3.0 is a development of this where the metaverse sits, and essentially the emphasis here will be on decentralized platforms and applications. So instead of having one central authority that kind of governs the operations of these platforms, Web 3.0 technologies and the communities that exist within them kind of form self-governance, in a kind of attempt to decentralize the approach, basically. And this question of decentralization is really important when it comes to user safety and brand safety. And yeah, I've rambled a little bit there. A lot of these technologies are kind of very nascent and they'll no doubt develop over time. But for me, as I said, I think once I kind of understood the technologies of how the metaverse, it kind of helped me to build that slightly bigger picture, I suppose.
And physically, what does the metaverse look like? And is there? We obviously know Facebook rebranded their name to Meta. Are they the only platform out there where you can go and engage, or are there other platforms out there?
No, I mean there's lots of platforms, and I think so you've kind of got like if you think of gaming, you've got companies such as Roblox as one example to that, where these platforms have actually been around for quite a long time. They're not to say they haven't just kind of been created in the last 6 months or a year when kind of really the buzz and the hype around the metaverse has been created. But no, there's lots of different platforms, and I think the point of the metaverse is that I could go into one of these environments and create my own virtual world, my own metaverse. It's not to say there'll be a limited number of platforms that exist, and you sort of go, here are the 10 platforms that exist within the metaverse. How do I engage with them? People will be creating their own virtual worlds within those, and it's endless, really. So yeah, as I say, it's not a case of thinking, okay, what are the leading social media platforms? And most people can kind of list those off. It's more decentralized than that, really.
So I can literally go in and create my own universe and then invite people to it. Is that what you're saying? Is that?
Yeah, that can happen today.
So that's the first thing I've learned today. I'm sure there'll be more things, but I thought it was literally there's big companies like your Facebooks. They've set up these metaverses, and you can go in, you can buy land, you can interact with each other, you can go to a concert, but it's all pre-built, if that makes sense. It's not like we're going on Twitter or Facebook or Snap or Instagram and creating our own version of it, if that makes sense. It's it's already pre-built. So what you're saying is someone can literally go in and create pretty much whatever they want, really.
Yeah, I mean, and what you said is completely right. That does exist. There are pre-built kind of spaces in the metaverse. But yeah, you can kind of add to that as you can go in and create your own environments and invite different users to those spaces. Whether you're an individual user like I've sat at home, or whether you're a brand, an advertiser, an agency, or whoever you might be, or a retailer, you can kind of create those unique spaces as well.
Amazing. And then relating it back to the industry that we work in, how does the metaverse impact brands? And especially from your side, working on the agency side, what are you doing in this space? I can understand it's a lot of education right now. It's learning, it's fact finding, but yeah, it'd be great to understand from an agency perspective and working with your clients, what are you guys doing, or are you doing anything when it comes to the metaverse?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think we're still certainly at that stage, as you said, of lots of education, kind of across the board of exactly what the metaverse looks like and kind of how brands and agencies can kind of have a presence here. I think we all know that kind of the pandemic kind of really accelerated the kind of digital revolution into this space, maybe a little bit quicker than it might have happened previously. But I think the key thing to remember, I mentioned it briefly earlier, is that some of the virtual worlds that kind of exist today, so like if you think of Fortnite or Roblox and these sorts of things, they've been around and the communities that are within them have been around a long time. It's only now really where brands and agencies are kind of starting to think about how can they kind of engage with these communities and in these particular environments. To kind of give you an example of the sort of scale, if we take Roblox for an example, there's about 50 million users a day in Roblox on a daily basis at the moment, basically. Sort of brand strategy and I guess kind of planning strategy does vary a lot, as always, across different brands. But I suppose broadly speaking, the way that we try and approach it is in sort of 4 different kind of key areas. So I mentioned that kind of audiences have been in this space for a while. So it's really important to kind of understand exactly what your brand values are and what your brand stands for. And make sure that the kind of authenticity is kind of really important within these spaces. As I said, brands are moving into a world where millions of users have been for a very long time. And it's making sure that marketers understand the different executions that are available within the metaverse, because there's countless different ones, but making sure it's really the best position for their brand and kind of authentic to their brand, rather than just saying, I want to have a presence in the metaverse because it's what kind of everyone is talking about, if you know what I mean. I then think it's about sort of the value of being in the metaverse. So obviously it's then kind of thinking about how does my presence in the metaverse kind of actually translate into driving value for my brand or for my agency in a metaverse context. So as I said, it's not just a case of a brand just wanting presence in the metaverse, but kind of looking for something, I suppose, a little bit more tangible in the way of, is there a service that they're offering? Is there a product that they're offering? And so on. Then it's sort of about exactly, if you kind of decided to be in the metaverse, it's exactly kind of like what place in the metaverse do you think your brand would sort of want to take? I can talk about kind of the various different brand activations that are available, but it's important for brands to kind of understand what these different activations look like and kind of how this translates to their brand. And is that where their audiences are as well that they're trying to reach? And this, I suppose, where brand safety in the metaverse kind of comes to the forefront, I suppose, is about the actual execution. Once you decided where you want to be, kind of how are you going to do it, kind of what partners you're going to work with, how are you going to engage with different users and so on. And that's where, as I said, where brand and user safety really kind of come to the forefront of those conversations that we're having with brands around sort of engaging in the metaverse, I suppose.
I'm trying to picture how this would look in terms of that, whether it's a client to agency interaction or whether it's the agency typically to a media owner or a publisher, because that's what I know is what I'm trying to say. So how would that brief come from the agency? Is there metaverse media owners that you would contact? Is it, how does that process look if, the audience listening to this podcast episode is more familiar with, a brief getting sent out, a proposal, creative examples, execution, etc., typical PowerPoint deck.
Yeah.
How does that kind of brief change? Or have we even got there yet? Is that just definitely not happened and it's more just proactive?
So I would say from my perspective and kind of what I'm exposed to in my role, it's not quite at that stage yet where you kind of, where it translates directly into the kind of campaign briefs that we sort of all know and all familiar with. I think the type of activation that happens in the metaverse is, and if I kind of think about how maybe some brands that we've worked with have been present, and as I said, there's many different forms that you can kind of take. So there's more, I suppose, familiar ad or product placements that exist within the metaverse, and this is where gaming, I suppose, really is at the forefront. And this is something that has been around for a while. We've kind of got lots of brands that are engaged in this space, lots of partners when it comes to gaming. And this is where it's kind of, if you think of in-game, if you're playing a car racing game, for example, on the side of the racetrack, you might have a in-game billboard as an example. That's could be classed as the metaverse, but this is, I suppose, the simplest form of activation and something that we see quite often. You then have some clients that kind of look to sort of retail or e-commerce spaces. They've kind of gone a little bit further and engaged with kind of opening a retail space as an example. So as a user, you can go into a certain retailer's space and transact with their products and even buy some of their products, whether that's an NFT, or in some cases you see that users transact with them, buy a pair of trainers, and then those trainers then get delivered in real life, if that makes sense. So it's just a different way, a different retail space, essentially. You then sort of have events as well. So kind of virtual events or virtual venues or spaces. As an example, there was a fashion week was held in a platform called Decentraland, and this was kind of held within the metaverse, and there were various fashion brands that made an appearance here, and all of these kind of brands offered slightly different engagements to their users, but it's just an example of how you can kind of take something that you might do in person and translate that into the metaverse. And then you have kind of NFTs and virtual possessions. So we've seen some brands issue kind of limited edition forms of certain pieces of their clothing or their goods or their products as NFTs, and engaging in the metaverse that way. I think I spoke kind of briefly around kind of some of the considerations that we work with brands when it comes to the metaverse, but ultimately, as you kind of touched upon, it's too early to kind of really say exactly what a kind of successful activation looks like, I suppose, and it does vary brand to brand as everything does. But yeah, we're not quite at that stage yet where you get a metaverse brief, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So the role of the agency right now in the metaverse space to the clients, to the advertisers, is really being knowledgeable in the space. I'm assuming right now that's the position, understanding what's coming to market, what will work for the brand and the audience, like you just mentioned. So is that the role the agency is playing right now when it comes to the metaverse? It's more the knowledge sharing, giving information, passing that back to the brand.
Yeah, exactly that, and just understanding what kind of activations are available basically for brands that do want to engage. Because as I said, it's kind of straightforward as we've sort of known in terms of getting a campaign brief, putting in media partners, assigning a budget, and kind of sending it over, if that makes sense. There's sort of much more nuance to that. But yeah, it is exactly what you said, really.
And it's just I just had a thought now. So I think over the last few years, or even the last 6 to 8 years, the industry's been working hard to most likely standardize, whether it's through programmatic channels, and it's pretty straightforward, right? So a DSP buys inventory from an SSP, plugs into the publisher inventory. Do you think now the metaverse has come in and just thrown it on its head? It's like, you've been doing that for the last 10 years now. This has been the trial and tested way. It's been safe. It's been working. Obviously, there's been issues, and we can all talk about that as well. But do you think this has really shaken that model up of media buying, or do you think eventually that will actually be the way that you buy? If we're just looking at buying media rather than sponsorships or events or anything like that in the metaverse, do you think I can set up a PMP in the future which is targeting digital billboards in the in the universe where people are walking around? I know that's probably in its simplest form, but do you think it will be? I think the question that I'm trying to ask is, will the metaverse or that part of the industry adopt to what has been going on for the last 10 years, or will it be the other way around? I know you don't have a crystal ball, but it'd be great to understand your take on that.
No, I mean, from my opinion, I think I don't see any reason. If we, as you said, if we think about the kind of ad placements and kind of rather than the kind of the spaces and the events and so on, we're seeing that move into that space already. There are DSPs, and that there are kind of DSPs that specialize within gaming environments, the same for SSPs as well. Some of the kind of measure, I suppose, if I think of it through a brand safety or kind of verification lens, that certainly has some way to go. But in terms of the kind of pipes, I suppose, that are used for a lot of the kind of campaign activation today, I don't see any reason why when it comes to kind of gaming in the metaverse that we have that already, but how that can't kind of develop and kind of follow a similar path where you kind of transact through a DSP and exchange and SSPs and so on, through to the kind of media owners that are offering those kind of spaces, those virtual ad placements, I suppose. I'm sure there'll be some stuff to work out along the way, but no, that we're kind of seeing that's how we do transact in the gaming environment today already.
Okay, great. And then in terms of brand safety, how brand safe would you say the metaverse is literally right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and it's something that I kind of get asked on a regular basis. I think for us, and I think for the industry, the way that we look at brand safety is that human safety or user safety really is kind of a prerequisite, and it sort of comes first before brand safety. If you know what I mean, if users and and humans aren't safe in these environments, then brands won't be either. If we think about what human safety or user safety might look like in the metaverse, it's essentially, as I said, it's kind of it takes our real lives and puts them into a virtual environment. So worst case scenario, if you imagine a world where individuals are kind of being bullied or harassed in these environments, the fact that it's in the metaverse could add kind of a new intensity to this kind of type of bullying or harassment. For gaming in particular, you've got things like haptic vests and haptic gloves where you can kind of interact with different users and you kind of get different sensors on your body and stuff like that. So that's kind of an area that is being looked at in terms of how do we address kind of human safety in these environments. Also, one key consideration when it comes to user safety is the gamification of the metaverse that we see in lots of the environments today is a really big draw for children. Obviously, the kind of child safety is important across all of digital media that we have today, but I think there's going to kind of need to be specific consideration given to what child safety looks like in these environments. You then kind of have stuff that exists today already. So misinformation and disinformation are kind of really key challenges when it comes to digital media today, whether that's, I guess it's not a problem or a challenge that's new for social media platforms, but it's kind of how does this translate into the metaverse environment? If you think about in the metaverse, you might have an avatar, for example, or deepfakes and these types of things. If these type of actors are spreading disinformation or misinformation, it kind of adds that extra layer of potential harm. When
So
it
is
comes
that
to brand
somebody, in its simplest term, logging in as somebody that they're not? It could be a child that's 11 or 12, pretending that they're an adult.
yeah, that or even just because obviously lots of the within the metaverse, you can kind of create avatars, for example, which in some cases kind of scan your face and kind of create real life examples of you. There just kind of needs to be considerations around, if you think about it, just as an extreme example, someone uploading an avatar that looks like a government official, and kind of maybe talking about something that spreading disinformation. That hasn't happened, but that's just an example of something that kind of could happen. If you think about deepfakes and kind of how disinformation and misinformation is a problem on social media, how that kind of translates or could translate into these environments, really. If we think about brand safety, I'm sure lots of the kind of people listening to this will be familiar with kind of the core principles of brand safety. So it's kind of about the transparency of the environments that you're running in, the controls that are available for you as an advertiser and as an agency in these environments, the measurement that's available, the reporting and so on. And also kind of there's a difference between brand safety and brand suitability. So brand safety being environments and content that no brand would feel kind of safe against, whereas suitability you might have different brands that feel comfortable against different types of activations. So these all remain really important in the metaverse. However, it's the platforms and the technology that power the metaverse that still have some work to do to kind of address these basics, basically. If you think about some of the kind of core components for measuring these types of things, if you think of brand safety, traditionally this has been metadata on a page, or for example, has been used to measure brand safety. What does that look like in virtual worlds? Or if you think of viewability as an example, kind of going back to my IS days, you'd have a verification tag, which would fire onto a page and measure kind of how that ad unit works within the browser and kind of give you a verification measurement. It's very difficult to then translate that into a kind of virtual world where you're gaming and you kind of have a billboard that flies past as you're driving past in a car and so on. So yeah, I think the metaverse is kind of, as the metaverse is introducing new platforms that kind of to address brand safety, what's really key here is that we kind of have continued industry collaboration and standards. So if you think of brand safety, we have the Global Alliance for Responsible Media that have their brand safety and suitability framework. They're looking at the metaverse and virtual worlds to kind of see how this can translate into that space. You've then got obviously people like the IAB and so on that kind of have their measurement frameworks, whether it's the SDK or and so on and stuff like that standardizes measurement and stuff like that across fraud and viewability. So it's really important that these kind of develop and as we see more platforms develop in the metaverse, start to kind of work in that space as well. And yeah, as I said, ultimately we should kind of see human safety as a precondition of brand safety. So it's just kind of keeping all of that in mind really, and navigating it through the different environments that are available.
And do you think all of this, you mentioned working together, but does it also require all these different platforms to be opting in for this because they would need to get, certain third-party vendors involved in the stack or involved in their integration. Does that need that opt-in, or is there another way around that in terms of brand safety?
Yeah, so at the moment, if we think about gaming as an example, if you take any of the kind of verification partners, sometimes there's different one-to-one integrations that are required with these certain platforms, and that's not because to say these platforms are kind of reluctant to have this measurement. It's more of a case of they are very unique environments that require, in some cases, that really kind of bespoke one-to-one kind of deep integration between the kind of different tech stacks to make sure that the measurement that is needed is there. But then having said that, we are also seeing lots of gaming environments are accepting kind of different tags and different measurements just as standard. So the same way you kind of wrap your kind of ad server tag, let's say, and you'd run a campaign across programmatic and social, and gaming being one of those environments, and the measurement looks the same across all of them. And I think that's where kind of actors like the IAB and the kind of standards that they're creating are really important, because you need that industry standard for kind of the platforms, the verification vendors, the agencies, the brands to kind of know exactly what they're looking at, where they're looking for it, and what's available, basically.
Okay, great. And from your experience over the last, I suppose, year or so, have there been specific brands that have invested into the metaverse, or at least you mentioned gaming as kind of like the obvious ones, but have there been other verticals that have invested into the metaverse?
So when you say different verticals, do you mean different types of activations in the metaverse, or different types of kind of client verticals that
Different types of client verticals, yeah.
Yeah. So no, absolutely. I think I kind of mentioned the kind of different types of activations, so NFTs and events and retail and commerce. We are seeing different brands engage in different ways across the metaverse. And I don't think it's the case of kind of saying this brand only wants to activate this way. We have brands that are very kind of leaned in gaming and kind of see gaming as a really kind of key area for them, and others that are a little bit more reluctant at gaming because potentially some of the risks that come in gaming, if you think of live streaming and these types of things. So yeah, not the clearest answer, I suppose, but it does really kind of vary per brand of exactly how they activate. And we are seeing different brands have very different engagements in the kind of platforms and the spaces that exist.
Amazing. Sustainability is something that I suppose has been a conversation point, or something that I think we should all be looking at and should have been looking at a long time ago, but it's been more front of our minds, I suppose, this year, and definitely next year. I think that will only amplify. How sustainable do you think is the metaverse?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question. I think a lot of the work that's going on in this industry at the moment, when it comes to kind of reduction of carbon through the supply chain, will translate over into the metaverse. But I do think some of the metaverse technologies themselves kind of do have unique considerations when it comes to sustainability. If you think of cryptocurrency and NFTs as one example, as I said, these are very prevalent within the metaverse, and cryptocurrencies in particular require a lot of mining, which is very carbon intensive due to the kind of validation method that's used on these cryptocurrencies called proof of work, which basically how this works is sort of, I won't get into this in too much detail because I'm sure there's people that know more about this listening than I do, but essentially the way that cryptocurrencies previously kind of got validated was that there'd be a chain of kind of data that all gets validated simultaneously on the blockchain. This kind of simultaneous or competitive validation, I suppose, generates very high energy usage. What we are seeing though, which is positive, is moving to a concept which is called proof of stake rather than proof of work. And this basically removes that competitive validation method of validating cryptos and NFTs on the blockchain. And kind of rather than mining all at the same time, proof of stake essentially assigns one validator on the blockchain to each transaction, which kind of removes that simultaneous validation that's going on and reduces the kind of high energy uses that we see or have seen across crypto. And there are some cryptocurrencies that have already moved over to this new validation method, which is great. Also, if we think of AI or the algorithms that kind of power the internet that we know today, but will inevitably end up powering the metaverse as well, and the kind of different experiences that we see, training these AI models does generate a lot of energy usage as well. The World Economic estimated that training one AI model can create 5 times more greenhouse gases than the average car emits in a lifetime, just to kind of give an idea of what that looks like. And I think for me, that's something, it's kind of translating something that feels quite alien, I suppose. Someone says training AI generates a lot of energy, and it's kind of like, okay, what does that actually mean? So when I read that, it kind of translates into something that's a little bit more tangible. You then also have the hardware itself that sort of powers this. So you've got obviously your virtual reality goggles as one example. This hardware kind of requires lithium batteries. It can also kind of create waste, as kind of any kind of hardware can. So we're kind of seeing and kind of pushing for like incentivized recycling and reduction schemes across this type of hardware as well. But one element is that, to not sound completely negative about it all, is that obviously with these points of access to certain things being opened up by the metaverse, will we see less traveling and less movement and less emissions from that point of view as a result? So it's kind of, that's something that's still yet to kind of have any real data behind it, but that's just kind of an interesting way to look at it, is if I can just join a music concert, for example, rather than traveling to it or flying to it, there's obviously reduced impact there as well.
Yeah, because that's how I would have thought of the sustainability angle would have been. It is more sustainable because less traveling, but yeah, it's very interesting what you mentioned in terms of the actual output and carbon emissions that are involved within the digital economy or the digital side of things. It's crazy, right? And we've had a previous episode on that, which really surprised me on the amount of carbon emissions that are involved with our day-to-day digital advertising, the campaigns, the creatives, and serving of them as well. So yeah, that's definitely interesting. I suppose I've not really asked this question yet, and it's probably the elephant in the room. But do you feel that we will lose that human contact and relationship if everything is on and if everything is on the metaverse? And it is interesting, right? Because these are kind of more conversations people are having probably at the pub or in a coffee shop, saying, rather than going for an interview, seeing someone face to face. And we're used to it a little bit since the pandemic. Everything's been virtual, Zoom calls. People aren't going into work as much, so that kind of face to face interaction has definitely dropped. But does that worry you when it comes to the metaverse, that we will lose that face-to-face contact?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I think from my personal point of view, I don't think that you can kind of replace that in-person kind of contact that we have, whether that's socially or from a work point of view. And I don't think we'll necessarily lose that. It almost will kind of have more value on those types of interactions than we had previously. I think the way that I try and look at it is that this unlocks more potential for connections rather than necessarily replacing what we already have today. Like if I speak from my own kind of personal point of view, I don't think I would decide to meet my friends on the metaverse rather than kind of go and see them. But equally, if there was a friend that lived the other side of the world, where I could kind of engage with them in these spaces, where I couldn't have done previously, that's kind of an element where it kind of unlocks more potential for that kind of interaction rather than necessarily replacing it. That's kind of how I look at it. I think it will vary for different people and in different instances. And as you say, it's kind of something that we've all kind of, not necessarily the metaverse, but kind of this kind of working from home and all of that type of thing. We've all kind of had to adapt to it, and kind of done it overall pretty successfully, I think, because we kind of had to. But yeah, I don't necessarily see it as a negative in terms of replacing kind of those key interactions that we have in person.
And I think it's one of those things, it's going to happen, right? So, brands, if we look at it from going back to kind of what we do in digital advertising, it's just going to happen. So us as stakeholders within the industry, as well as brands, agencies, publishers, whoever it is, need to know about what we can do and how we can help the client at the end of the day. So yeah, I think it's something that should be front of mind. We should all be looking into it in a lot more detail. Is there any advice for those people that are, like me, for example? I wouldn't know where to start, which platform to go on, to have a little nose around. Is there any kind of first steps you think someone like me that should take in understanding more about the metaverse, or who wants to be more involved?
Yeah, no, that's I think I think it's kind of actions that the industry as a whole can kind of start to take. I don't whether that's kind of an individual kind of person at home that's more interested within this space, or whether that's an agency or a brand. I think the kind of key really, and we've mentioned it a few times throughout this, it is kind of the education. So kind of work with kind of any experts within your business, or kind of any resources online that are kind of experts in this space, to kind of gain, I suppose, that kind of baseline knowledge of Web3 and Metaverse and virtual reality and so on, and kind of the different complexities that these platforms kind of that are available today, primarily in gaming, kind of what that looks like and kind of how you can engage with it. And when it comes to kind of brand safety, I suppose, is that, as I mentioned before, that it's kind of really key that this collaboration, like with this collaboration when it comes to, as we move into this space and people kind of learning more about it, kind of apply those basic principles of responsibility and safety to kind of any campaigns that you're running, any products that you're creating, any partnerships that you're sort of building. And as always, right, brands kind of have the opportunity here to really lean in and kind of co-create these guidelines and the guardrails for what a metaverse will rely on in the future, really. And I think the key thing really is it's going to evolve. As you say, it's more and more platforms are being kind of we're seeing more platforms on a daily basis. And I think for me, when I first kind of started thinking about the metaverse, I almost saw it as a binary thing of we're not in the metaverse and then one day we're going to be in the metaverse, if that makes sense. And that's just not necessarily the case. There's, as I said, some of these environments have existed for a long time. And like you can either be in a gaming environment, or anyone that played that Pokemon game has kind of been within the metaverse, if you know what I like, if you know what I mean. And then a kind of one thing that we kind of see is really key when it kind of comes to kind of building responsibility with these platforms is to get ahead. And that's why right now is a really good opportunity to do that. Responsibility kind of can't really be an afterthought when these platforms are creating or users are engaging within these environments. We're kind of at that point now where it doesn't really exist yet. So that's the point where really you can kind of start to build those guardrails and have the opportunity to shape exactly what responsibility might look like and brand safety might look like in these spaces, basically.
Okay, sounds good. We always finish our podcast episode with this question, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on your response. So yeah, if you had a superpower in AdTech, what would it be?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So I think if it's a superpower for AdTech specifically, I think, and it might not be the most interesting answer in the world, but I think it would be to be much more up to speed with kind of different computer languages. So whether that's Python or JavaScript or so on. I never really had an eye for that type of thing previously, and I'm by no means had kind of much exposure to it now. But the longer I've kind of worked in this industry, kind of realized it really does underpin pretty much every platform that we use, every technology that we use within digital advertising. So if I could kind of click my fingers and have a superpower, it would be to kind of really understand how these computer languages work, basically.
Amazing, great answer. That's all we've got time in today's episode. Thanks, Alex, for your time.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.